The backyard had always been my sanctuary, a place where time seemed to slow, and the world's noise faded into a comforting hush. It had been 3 years since my husband Mark passed away, and though the lawn was still neatly trimmed and the flower beds well tended, the space felt quieter now, almost abandoned. Mark used to spend hours here, pruning the rose bushes and coaxing blooms from the stubborn hydrangeas. I couldn't bring myself to care for them the way he had, though I tried. The hydrangeas hadn't bloomed in 2 summers. I was 58, but some days I felt far older. My reflection in the glass patio door often startled me, silver strands weaving through my once dark hair, the faint lines at the corners of my eyes deepening with each sleepless night. It wasn't just age, it was loneliness too, a weight I carried in silence. My friends said I should join a book club or start volunteering, but the idea of forcing conversation with strangers felt exhausting. I told myself I was content with my routines, morning coffee by the kitchen window, afternoons lost in novels, and evenings sipping chamomile tea as twilight settled over the yard. But tonight, the tea tasted bitter. Or maybe it was just my mood. I had spent the day in a haze, scrolling through old photos of Mark and me on vacations, at family dinners, laughing over some private joke that now felt impossible to recall. I couldn't shake the ache in my chest, the persistent thought that I'd been living in a kind of limbo since his death. The stillness of the house pressed in around me, so I stepped outside, hoping the cool night air might clear my mind. The backyard was dimly lit by the moon, the shadows of the trees casting jagged patterns across the grass. I pulled my cardigan tighter around me and walked toward the garden. That's when I saw him. Ethan, my stepson. He was sitting on the edge of the patio, his long legs stretched out before him, a cigarette glowing faintly in his hand. I stopped short, startled. I hadn't realized he was still awake. "Didn't mean to scare you," he said, glancing up at me. His voice was low, a little rough but familiar. I took a cautious step closer, folding my arms across my chest. "I didn't know you smoked." "I don't, not really." He exhaled slowly, the smoke curling upward before dissipating into the night. "Just felt like it tonight." Ethan had come back home 2 months ago, after a messy breakup with a girlfriend whose name I never cared to learn. He'd been distant since Mark's funeral, our interactions reduced to brief phone calls and holiday visits. When he showed up on my doorstep, suitcase in hand, he looked like a ghost of the confident young man I remembered. Thinner, quieter. His once sparkling clouded with something I couldn't quite name. I wasn't sure how to feel about him living here again. He was polite, even kind, but there was a tension between us, an unspoken acknowledgement of the fact that I wasn't his real mother. I had married Mark when Ethan was already in college, and though he had been warm toward me in those early years, we'd never developed the easy closeness I had hoped for. I hesitated before sitting down on the patio steps a few feet away from him. The night was cooler than I expected, and I tugged my cardigan tighter around me. "Couldn't sleep?" I asked. He shook his head, his gaze fixed on the distant fence line. "You?" "Same." We sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds the faint rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a cricket. I glanced at him out of the corner of my eye, noticing how his hair, damp from a recent shower, curled slightly at the ends. He looked so much like his father in that moment that my chest tightened. "I miss him too," Ethan said suddenly, his voice breaking the quiet. He didn't look at me, but his words hung heavy in the air. I swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. "I know," I said softly. Another stretch of silence passed, but this one felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't quite name. I wanted to comfort him, to say something that might bridge the unspoken distance between us, but the words wouldn't come. "I think I'm going to call it a night," I said finally, standing and brushing off my hands. Ethan nodded, flicking the cigarette into the grass and crushing it under his heel. "Good night." As I stepped back into the house, I felt his eyes linger on me, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel entirely invisible. The next morning began like any other. I woke early, wrapped myself in my robe, and padded downstairs to brew a pot of coffee. The kitchen was quiet, the only sound the soft hum of the refrigerator. I had grown used to this silence, had even come to prefer it. But today, it felt different. Last night's conversation with Ethan lingered in my mind like the faint scent of his cigarette smoke. I was pouring my second cup of coffee when he appeared in the doorway. His hair was slightly mussed, and he was wearing a faded gray t-shirt that clung to his shoulders in a way I couldn't help but notice. He looked younger in the soft morning light, almost boyish. "Morning," he said, his voice low and groggy. "Morning," I replied, trying to sound casual. He opened the fridge and pulled out the orange juice, drinking straight from the carton. I raised an eyebrow but said nothing, too amused by the reminder of how much he was still in some ways the boy I first met years ago. "Want some coffee?" I asked, holding up the pot. He glanced at me, then nodded. "Yeah, thanks." I poured him a mug and slid it across the counter. He took a sip and winced. "God, you like it strong." "It's the only way to drink it," I said, smirking. For a moment, we stood in companionable silence, sipping our coffee. It felt nice. Unexpectedly so. "You were up late last night?" I said, finally, breaking the quiet. He shrugged. "Couldn't sleep. Guess my head's been all over the place lately." I nodded, not wanting to push him. But then he surprised me. "You ever feel like you're just stuck?" he asked, staring down at his mug. "Like you're going through the motions but nothing really means anything?" His words hit me harder than I expected. I set my coffee down, the warmth of the ceramic grounding me. "Yes," I said softly. "I feel that way all the time." He looked up at me then, his expression open and raw in a way that made my chest ache. "How do you deal with it?" I hesitated. How could I explain that I wasn't sure I was dealing with it at all? That some days the only thing keeping me going was sheer habit? "I try to focus on small things," I said finally. "A good book, a walk outside, even just a really good cup of coffee. It doesn't fix everything, but it helps." He nodded, his gaze lingering on me. "Thanks," he said after a moment. The days that followed were marked by small, shared moments like this. Ethan started joining me for breakfast every morning, our conversations growing a little longer each time. At first we talked about safe, surface-level things, news headlines, the weather, whether the hydrangeas might bloom this year. But gradually, the conversations deepened. One morning, he told me about the breakup that had driven him back here. How he'd thought he was going to marry her, only to discover she'd been cheating on him for months. "I felt like such an idiot," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Like I should have seen it coming." "You're not an idiot," I said, my voice firm. "You trusted someone you loved. There's nothing wrong with that." He looked at me, something unreadable in his eyes. "Thanks," he said quietly. Another time, I opened up about my struggles after Mark's death. How hard it had been to find a sense of purpose without him, to figure out who I was on my own. "I thought grief would be this big, dramatic thing," I said. "But it's not. It's quiet. It sneaks up on you in the middle of the night or when you see something that reminds you of them. It's like this constant background hum that never really goes away." Ethan didn't say anything at first, but then he reached across the table and squeezed my hand. His touch was warm, grounding. "You're stronger than you think," he said softly. One afternoon, about a week after our late-night conversation in the backyard, Ethan asked if I wanted to join him by the pool. It was an unusually warm day for early spring, the sun bright and inviting. I hesitated at first. I hadn't worn a swimsuit in years and wasn't sure I wanted to start now. But something in the way he smiled at me, boyish and hopeful, made it hard to say no. I changed into a modest black one-piece, throwing on a loose cover-up for good measure. When I stepped outside, Ethan was already lounging by the water, a pair of sunglasses perched on his nose. He looked effortlessly relaxed, his toned chest and arms catching the sunlight in a way that made my breath hitch. "Thought you weren't going to come," he teased, sitting up as I approached. "I almost didn't," I admitted, settling into the lounge chair beside him. He handed me a glass of iced tea. "Glad you did." We spent the afternoon talking and laughing, the tension between us easing in the warmth of the sun. At one point, I dipped my feet in the water, the coolness a welcome relief against the heat. Ethan joined me, his shoulder brushing against mine as he sat beside me. "You should swim," he said, grinning. "It's amazing." I shook my head. "I'm fine right here." "Come on," he said, standing and offering me his hand. "Live a little." Before I could protest, he pulled me to my feet and led me to the edge of the pool. The water was colder than I expected, and I let out a small yelp as it splashed over me. Ethan laughed, his boyish grin lighting up his face. Told you it'd be fun. For a moment, I forgot about everything. The years of grief, the guilt that always seemed to linger at the edges of my mind. All I felt was the sun on my skin, the water lapping at my legs, and Ethan's laughter ringing in my ears. But then his hand brushed against mine, and the moment shifted. I looked up at him, and for a second, the world seemed to tilt. His gaze held mine, something unspoken passing between us. I pulled away, retreating to my lounge chair. My heart was racing, my mind a whirl of confusion and guilt. What was I doing? What was he doing? Later that evening, as I sat on the porch with a glass of wine, Ethan joined me. He didn't say anything at first, just sat down beside me and stared out at the darkened yard. About earlier, he began, his voice hesitant. I shook my head. You don't have to say anything. No, I do, he said, turning to face me. I don't want things to be weird between us. They're not, I said quickly, though my voice betrayed me. He studied me for a moment, his expression unreadable. You sure about that? I looked away, unable to meet his gaze. Good night, Ethan, I said, standing and retreating into the house. But as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop thinking about him. About the way his hand had felt against mine, the way he had looked at me by the pool. And for the first time in years, I felt something other than grief. Something I wasn't ready to name. The days passed, each one carrying with it a subtle shift in the way Ethan and I interacted. There was an undercurrent between us now. A quiet tension that neither of us acknowledged, but both of us felt. I caught him watching me sometimes, his gaze lingering a second too long when I bent to grab something from the lower cabinets, or the way his eyes followed me when I walked into the room. And though I tried to pretend otherwise, I wasn't immune to him either. It wasn't just his looks, though they were undeniably striking. The broad shoulders, the strong jawline, the way his laughter seemed to transform him. It was his presence. He had a way of filling the space around him, making the house feel less empty, less haunted. One evening, I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when he wandered in, barefoot and casual. He leaned against the counter, watching me slice vegetables. Smells good, he said, his voice warm. Just spaghetti, I replied, glancing at him briefly. Nothing fancy. Still better than anything I could make. He paused, then added, I don't think I've ever told you how much I appreciate this. Letting me stay here, I mean. I stopped chopping and looked up at him. His expression was serious, his blue eyes soft with sincerity. You don't have to thank me, I said. This is your home too. He smiled, but there was something sad about it. It hasn't felt like home in a long time. Not until now. His words made my chest tighten, a pang of guilt and something else, something warmer, flaring inside me. I turned back to the cutting board, my hands trembling slightly as I resumed slicing. You've been through a lot, I said quietly. So have you. I didn't reply, but the weight of his gaze on me was impossible to ignore. That night, after dinner, I retreated to the porch with a book, hoping to distract myself from the thoughts swirling in my head. But no sooner had I settled into the chair than Ethan appeared, a glass of whiskey in hand. Mind if I join you? He asked. I hesitated, then nodded. Sure. He sat down beside me, the chair creaking slightly under his weight. The air was cool, the faint scent of blooming jasmine carried on the breeze. For a while, we just sat there, the quiet punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves. What are you reading? He asked eventually. I held up the book so he could see the cover. An old favorite. He leaned closer to get a better look, his shoulder brushing against mine. The warmth of his skin sent a shiver through me, and I forced myself to focus on the book in my lap. You ever feel like you're missing something? He asked suddenly. I looked at him, surprised by the question. What do you mean? He took a sip of his whiskey, his gaze fixed on the darkened yard. I don't know. Like there's this void inside you, and no matter what you do, you can't fill it. I hesitated, unsure how to respond. I think everyone feels that way sometimes, I said finally. Especially after losing someone. He nodded, his jaw tightening. Yeah. The silence that followed was heavy, charged with something unspoken. I could feel his eyes on me, and when I finally turned to meet his gaze, I felt a jolt of electricity. You've been good to me, he said softly. More than I deserve. My heart was pounding now, my thoughts a chaotic mess. Ethan? Before I could finish, he reached out and brushed a strand of hair from my face. The gesture was so unexpected, so intimate, that I froze. "You don't have to keep everything bottled up," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's okay to let someone in." For a moment I considered leaning into him, letting myself give in to the pull I felt. But the weight of guilt was too much, and I stood abruptly, stepping away from him. "I think it's time for me to head to bed," I said, my voice shaking slightly. Ethan didn't try to stop me, but as I walked away, I could feel his gaze following me, and the weight of it lingered long after I closed my bedroom door. The following days were a blur of avoidance and stolen glances. I threw myself into chores, organizing the garage, scrubbing the kitchen until it gleamed, anything to keep myself busy. But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the memory of that night on the porch. The way his touch had ignited something in me I thought long buried. Ethan seemed to sense my retreat, and though he gave me space, I caught glimpses of his frustration. A sigh here, a quiet look there. He wasn't angry, exactly, but I could tell he was waiting for something, for me to address the thing we were both trying so hard to ignore. It wasn't until the stormy night that everything came to a head. The thunderstorm rolled in just after dusk, the first crack of lightning illuminating the darkened sky. The power went out soon after, plunging the house into darkness. I fumbled for the flashlight I kept in the kitchen drawer, my pulse quickening as the storm raged outside. "Ethan?" I called out, my voice echoing in the silence. "Here," he said, stepping into the room with his own flashlight. The beam of light cast shadows across his face, making his features seem sharper, more intense. "Power's out," I said unnecessarily. He smirked, his expression softening. "Yeah, I noticed." We stood there for a moment, the storm rumbling in the background. The air between us felt charged, much like the storm outside. "You okay?" he asked, his voice gentle. I nodded, though my hands were trembling slightly. "Just, storms make me a little anxious." Without a word, he stepped closer and rested a hand on my arm. The warmth of his touch was grounding, calming, and I found myself leaning into it without thinking. "Come sit with me," he said. He led me to the living room, where we lit a few candles, and settled onto the couch. The flickering light cast a soft glow over the room, making it feel intimate, almost surreal. "Do you remember the camping trips we used to take?" Ethan asked after a while, his voice breaking the silence. I smiled faintly. "Of course." Mark always insisted on making pancakes over the fire, even though they never turned out right. Ethan chuckled. He'd burn the first 3 and then blame the pan. We laughed together, the sound soft and genuine, and for a moment it felt like the past few years of grief and distance had melted away. But then the laughter faded, and the silence returned, heavier this time. Ethan reached out and took my hand, his fingers warm and steady against mine. "Ethan," I began, but he cut me off. "I know," he said softly. "I know this is complicated, but I can't pretend I don't feel something. And I don't think you can either." I stared at him, my heart racing. His words were like a spark, igniting something inside me I'd tried so hard to suppress. "I don't know what to say," I whispered. "Then don't say anything," he replied, his voice low and steady. And then, before I could think, before I could stop myself, I leaned in. When I leaned in, the world seemed to hold its breath. The flickering candlelight danced across Ethan's face, his eyes searching mine as if waiting for me to pull back, to retreat, but I didn't. My heart raced, and 100 thoughts screamed in my mind. This was wrong, dangerous, impossible. But none of them were loud enough to drown out the quiet, undeniable truth. I didn't want to stop. When our lips met, it was tentative at first, almost hesitant. His breath was warm, tasting faintly of whiskey and something I couldn't name. I froze, unsure of what to do or what this even meant, but then his hand moved to my face, his thumb brushing against my cheek, and the kiss deepened. For the first time in years, I felt alive. My skin tingled where his fingers trailed along my jawline, and my heart pounded so loudly that I was sure he could hear it. It wasn't just desire, it was a kind of awakening, a surge of emotions I had buried for so long that I'd forgotten they existed. But then, as quickly as it began, reality came crashing back. I pulled away, breathless, my hand instinctively covering my mouth. "Ethan," I whispered, my voice trembling. "We can't. I can't." His brow furrowed, but he didn't move away. "Why not?" he asked softly. Because I began, but the words wouldn't come. How could I explain the tangled mess of guilt and fear twisting inside me? How could I tell him that I had spent years trying to be the kind of woman people respected, the kind of woman who didn't cross lines like this? You feel it too, he said, his voice quiet but firm. It wasn't a question. I looked away, tears stinging my eyes. It doesn't matter. It matters to me, he said, his hand still resting lightly on mine. It matters more than anything. I wanted to argue, to tell him he was wrong, that this was a mistake. But when I looked at him, really looked at him, I saw the raw vulnerability in his eyes, the way his shoulders slumped ever so slightly as if he were bracing for rejection. And I realized I couldn't deny the truth any longer. I don't know what to do, I admitted, my voice barely audible. He reached for my hand again, threading his fingers through mine. Then let me show you, he said. He kissed me again, and this time I didn't pull away. His touch was gentle but insistent, his hands warm as they slid to my waist. He pulled me closer, and I felt myself melting into him, the tension I had been carrying for years finally beginning to unravel. The rain outside battered against the windows, the storm's fury echoing the storm inside me. Every brush of his lips, every caress of his hands, ignited something I hadn't felt in years, a hunger, a need, a desperate longing to feel connected to another person. Are you sure? He whispered against my ear, his breath sending shivers down my spine. I hesitated for only a moment before nodding. Yes. He led me upstairs, his hand firm but gentle on my lower back. The house was dark except for the faint glow of the candles we had left behind, their light flickering softly in the stairwell. When we reached my bedroom, I felt a brief pang of doubt, a momentary urge to retreat. But then he turned to me, his expression tender and unguarded, and the doubt dissolved. I've got you, he said quietly, as if sensing my hesitation. His words were a promise, and I clung to them as he guided me to the bed. The world outside ceased to exist as we came together, the storm a distant backdrop to the quiet, unspoken connection we shared. The details of that night were a blur of sensations, his lips trailing along my collarbone, the warmth of his hands as they explored every inch of me, the way he whispered my name like a prayer. He was attentive, patient, every movement filled with care and intention. I hadn't realized how much I craved this, not just the physical closeness, but the intimacy, the feeling of being seen and wanted. For so long, I had convinced myself that those parts of my life were over, that they had been buried alongside Mark. But Ethan was proving me wrong, showing me that I wasn't as hollow as I had believed. When it was over, we lay tangled together in the dim light, the storm outside finally beginning to subside. His arm was draped across my waist, his breathing slow and steady against my shoulder. I stared at the ceiling, my mind a whirlwind of emotions, relief, guilt, fear, and something dangerously close to hope. I don't regret this, he said softly, breaking the silence. I turned to look at him, his face half hidden in the shadows. You should. Do you? He asked, his eyes searching mine. I wanted to say yes, to tell him that this was a mistake and that we could never let it happen again. But I couldn't bring myself to lie. No, I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled faintly, leaning in to press a gentle kiss to my forehead. Then, that's all that matters. The night stretched on, the two of us cocooned in a fragile, stolen moment that felt like it existed outside of time. But even as I drifted to sleep in his arms, I knew that morning would bring questions and consequences we couldn't avoid. The first thing I noticed when I woke was the silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a stillness that felt almost oppressive. The faint light of dawn seeped through the curtains, painting the room in muted shades of gray and gold. And then I felt him. Ethan's arm was draped across my waist, his body warm and solid against mine. For a moment, I allowed myself to lie there, to soak in the quiet intimacy of the moment. His breathing was slow and steady, his chest rising and falling against my back. It felt safe, comforting. But as the fog of sleep lifted, reality came rushing back, sharp and unforgiving. The events of the night before played out in my mind with startling clarity. The kiss, the way he'd looked at me, the way I'd let myself fall into him completely. Guilt surged through me, cold and relentless. What had I done? I slipped out of bed as quietly as I could, careful not to wake him. My robe hung on the back of the door, and I wrapped it around myself like armor as I padded to the window. The backyard was still wet from the storm, the grass glistening in the early morning light. I pressed a hand to the cool glass, my thoughts racing. I had crossed a line, one I couldn't uncross. What would Mark think if he were here? What would people say if they knew? But beneath the guilt was something else, something I was afraid to name. A part of me felt alive. For the first time in years, I had felt wanted, desired, seen. That part of me whispered that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't as broken as I'd believed. Behind me, I heard the rustle of sheets, followed by the soft creak of the bed. "Morning," Ethan said, his voice rough with sleep. I turned to face him, my heart clenching at the sight of him sitting there, his hair mussed and his eyes still heavy-lidded. He looked younger like this, almost boyish, but there was a softness in his expression that made it clear he wasn't naive about what had happened between us. "Morning," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He studied me for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly. "Are you okay?" I hesitated, my hands tightening around the sash of my robe. "I don't know," I admitted. Ethan stood and crossed the room, his movements slow and deliberate. When he reached me, he hesitated for a moment before placing a hand on my shoulder. "You don't have to feel guilty," he said softly. I met his gaze, my throat tightening. "It's not that simple." "Maybe it is," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "What happened last night, it wasn't wrong. It wasn't planned, but it wasn't wrong either." I wanted to believe him, but the weight of years of social expectations and moral lines felt like a noose around my neck. "It's complicated," I said, looking away. Ethan sighed, his hand dropping to his side. "I'm not asking you to have all the answers right now, He paused, running a hand through his hair. "I just want you to know that I don't regret it. Not for a second." His words hung in the air, heavy and bittersweet. As he turned to leave, I called out to him, my voice trembling. "Ethan?" He stopped, glancing back at me. "Thank you," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "For what?" "For reminding me that I'm still alive." He nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips, before stepping out of the room. I stood there for a long time, staring out at the backyard. The storm had passed, but the ground was still wet, the air still heavy with the scent of rain. I didn't know what the future held, whether this was the beginning of something or the end. But for the first time in years, I felt the faintest glimmer of hope. And for now, that was enough.